Hi, thank you, Debbie. My name is Amanda Young, and I am with RTI International and a member of the Evaluation and Sustainability TTA project team. I'll be your host for today. As Debbie noted, I would like to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Storytelling for SCA Programs, Using the Power of Story to Build Strong Support for Your Program. This will be presented by Lisa Bailey-Vavanese. Lisa leads the Center for Court Innovation work on Second Chance Act program sustainability as part of the Evaluation and Sustainability Training and Technical Assistance Project for the Bureau of Justice Assistance. She brings extensive expertise in reentry program branding and communications, federal, state, and local grant funding, and private donor campaigns, among many other sustainability topics. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items for you. All participants are on mute. If you need technical support, please let us know through the chat pod. Debbie is our technical host and will be able to assist with any of those technical issues that you may have. If you have any questions for our presenter regarding today's material, please type them into the Q&A pod. We'll be reviewing those throughout the presentation and have several opportunities to answer questions. Without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to our presenter, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Before I move on, Amanda, can you all see my PowerPoint presentation okay and hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'm happy to talk with you about this topic. So why don't I just get started with a story? It is a true story. About 5 years ago, I helped develop and launch the Near West Side Peacemaking Project. It's a restorative justice program that diverts cases out of criminal court and into the community. Our very first case was with Rose and Clara. Rose and Clara went from being friends to outright enemies in the matter of weeks. Their arguments built from trailing each other home from school, pulling hair, hitting and spitting in the Rite Aid parking lot. Other kids egged them on, calling them fairies, saying they were weak if they didn't stand up for themselves. After a particularly bad fight, where a knife was pulled, and it was at school, they got kicked out of school and the police were contacted. This is where the Near West Side Peacemaking Project stepped in. Our coordinator, Leah, brought the two girls and their grown-ups to a peacemaking circle and explained that there was a better way. Leah invited 3 community volunteer peacemakers, all women, some of them young, some of them mothers, all who knew what it was like to grow up in a rough neighborhood where you're seen as weak if you don't fight. And that is what happened. At first, the grown-ups were pointing fingers, they were quick to blame, but something shifted during Circle. Everyone shared their experiences. They told their stories. And that's what Rosa and Claire needed. They needed their grown-ups to say, "We hear you." They needed their community support people to say, "Knock it off, this is your future." And so Rose and Clara apologized, and their grown-ups apologized. Rose and Clara agreed to stop the fighting. They were allowed back to school, and the police investigation would go no further. During that first year of that program launch, 26 cases entered into peacemaking, with 56 people in conflict, 23 trained community members in Circle, and 27 community support people. And that was a truly inspirational program. All right, so I'm going to put you to the test and see if you were listening and what you may remember from that story that I just shared. So in just one moment, you'll be asked to respond to 3 poll questions. Once everybody responds to those questions, we're going to share those answers. So I will let Debbie go ahead and launch the poll.
Lisa, let me know when you want me to end the polling.
I think we could give everybody 2 or 3 more seconds. So everyone, if you don't mind entering in those questions, we'll give you about 5 more seconds. All right, Debbie, let's see what people said.
Are you able to see the screen, the poll results, Lisa?
No, we're not. Could you maybe just read them for us? Oh, there they go. I can see them now. I hope the audience can as well. So I actually have to be honest, I get nervous every time I do this poll because I'm afraid it won't give me the results I want, but it never disappoints. The 2 first questions, which were about the narrative part of the story, almost everybody got right. And then when we look to that question about the statistic, we see that we do get a lower response rate. So thank you everybody for participating, and we're going to talk through what these results may mean. I'll have you go ahead and close the poll, Debbie. Thank you. So why storytelling? People can't face facts if they're
we're good until slide 30.
So first, we tell them a story. And this is true no matter what information about your program you're sharing. Program model, data, successes, tell it with a story. Stories have been the currency of human communication for decades, longer. And that role remains undiminished today. Our identities are derived from stories, our decisions guided by them. And brain science supports storytelling. According to scientists, information is better retained when told through a story. People only retain about 1/5 of what they read, but 4/5 of the images they form in their minds. Stories are stored as images and symbols in our brains and are generally recalled more accurately than facts. And I think our poll showed that. I have a question for you all, and it's kind of quirky, but I think it's fun. What animal ate Little Red Riding Hood's grandma? Just in your head, think through what that animal might be. I'm sure most of you know the animal that ate Little Red Riding Hood's grandma. It was the wolf. And why do we remember that particular part of that childhood story? Many of us probably have not read that story in decades. It's because we have an image in our mind and our brains retain images. So what does this mean for your program data and your evaluation findings? Numbers are critical and play an indispensable role in telling the story of your program. They provide legitimacy and demonstrate value. After all, I told you that my peacemaking project accepted 26 cases its first year. Without giving you that information, how would you have known that Rose and Clara weren't the only case? How would you have known that the police continued to value the program and referred more cases? Without collecting data and analyzing that data, you wouldn't learn that my program, when it entered its second year, only had 1 participant arrested on new charges. Learning how to share your data with a story triggers the connection in the brain that forms an image, and people remember images. We need our data to tell a story. So for today, part 1 of our webinar, I'm going to talk about telling a compelling narrative. How do you share that narrative story about your program? And then part 2, I'm going to talk about how do you tell a story with your data? How is it that you communicate the importance of your data to your audience? For my peacemaking story, the importance wasn't that the audience remembered the exact number, that 26 cases entered peacemaking. It was important that I demonstrate the legitimacy and the value, and you knew that more cases came to peacemaking and the police continued to value the program. A small note, I am going to leave time at the end of part 1 for some questions, so you won't have to hold them until the end. Remember, the chat function is for any technical questions you might have. Those will go to Debbie and she'll respond to you. And then if you want a question to be presented to me, you can use that in the Q&A function. So let's get started. How to tell a compelling narrative. Good stories cut through the clutter. They connect with people's hearts and they open their minds to your point of view. Stories don't. And all too often, that's what programs are telling. They're telling dull stories. First, understand your audience. Who needs to know about your program? What do they need to know about your program? When do they need to be informed, and what is the frequency in which they need to be informed? And how should they be informed? Social media, email, flyer, newsletter, annual report, live presentation, all those things you'll need to think through. And thinking about your audience, who are they? Are they funders, policymakers, elected officials, program partners, program participants, neighbors, neighborhoods, communities? Know your audience and get specific about what type of communication will be most effective for them. Your presentation should probably be different depending on your audience, and you should be prepared no matter what audience you're in front of. So the art of storytelling, how do you put together a good story and deliver that story? There are many experts in the field of storytelling. I think it's best to look for advice from those that speak to you and your program. I'm going to share today some of the best advice I've heard over the years. So the questions to ask. Who's the protagonist in your story? No, it cannot be your program or your organization. Stories are about people. Maybe it's a specific staff member, or maybe it's a program participant. But it needs to be personal. What's the hook? How are you going to draw your audience to your story? What keeps it interesting? Characters in stories encounter roadblocks. Where's the conflict? There's no drama without conflict. Have you included telling details? Are you painting the picture for your audience? Good stories tell just enough detail to set the theme and bring life to the characters. I told you that Rose and Clara fought in the Rite Aid parking lot. Those little details shape for you what these girls may be experiencing. It gives it context and life. What's the emotion? Audience want more than a recitation of facts. That's boring. They want an emotional experience. And is your meaning clear? Your story should have a crystal clear moral. Your audience should know exactly why you're telling it. So how do you build this story? How do you get to that point where you're telling that compelling narrative? I happen to love templates and frameworks. I'm type A. And I found this one by Brian McDonald particularly helpful, so I'm going to share it with you today. So the template goes like this. Once upon a time, and every day, until one day, and because of this, and because of this, until finally, and ever since that day. So let me help you unpack that a little bit and see how we would do this with a story. So I'm going to share with you a story that you'll recognize. So once upon a time, Dorothy lived in Kansas. And every day, Dorothy felt lonely and misunderstood. Until one day, a tornado transported Dorothy to Oz. And because of this, she wants to return home and must get to the wizard. And because of this, Dorothy must kill the witch. Until finally, Dorothy gets home, but in an unexpected way. And ever since that day, Dorothy realizes that she had the power all along. So if you think through the stories you may want to tell about your program, you might find a template like this helpful to weave that story into a compelling narrative. I'm going to connect the dots between the questions to ask and the framework. Who's the protagonist? Dorothy. What's the hook? She felt lonely and misunderstood. What keeps it interesting? She was transported to Oz. Where's the conflict? She wants to get home. Have you included telling details? She must get to the wizard and kill the witch. Where's the emotion? She finally gets home. And is the meaning clear? It is where she always belonged. Your audience should not have to guess at the moral of your story. Okay, so we've now talked a bit about crafting your story and how you might do that. And it could be for print or a live presentation. But if you are giving a live presentation, I'm going to share some specific tips about how to tell a story orally. And I'd mention, I know it's not for everyone, so just bear with me and we'll think through how you might be able to become more comfortable with telling your story in public. So here are some pro tips that I've found helpful. Be well organized. You can get nervous, we all do. So if you've organized your story, you'll feel better. Start on time, end on time, stay on topic. Your audience will love you if you give them an extra 3 minutes at the end of your presentation time that they can take back. They will stop listening if you start going 5 minutes long. Set a specific goal for your audience. You're going to hear me come back to this theme over and over again. Audience, audience, audience. Your storytelling is not about you, it's about what you need to communicate to your audience. Include an emotional component. Present as knowledgeable, credible, and passionate. Have your numbers to back everything up. Your voice should be well modulated and your body language strong. I'm going to explain a little bit about voice modulation. It refers to how you control your voice while you're telling your story. When we speak, we are able to change the message by varying tone, pitch, and rate of speech. Voice modulation is not easy and it should be practiced. It can mean the difference between a sleeping audience and an active, engaged audience. And there is power in some little tips, like pausing. It adds drama. You also can catch your breath and give yourself a minute to relax. Stress certain words for emphasis. Vary your pitch. Try a whisper. The key is to be natural. And you're more natural if you've practiced, because you know your story. And what about body language? Your gestures, your facial expressions. Good body language will build credibility with your audience. Some tips. Good posture, stand straight with arms and shoulders back. Do not cross your arms in front of you. Face the audience as much as possible. And if you can, use the space given. Move around, make eye contact. Your facial expression should be relaxed and positive. All of this, by the way, is much harder over Zoom or all the different virtual platforms we've been using. There's not really much you can do to use your body language or your hand gestures. I actually have an Italian background and I generally flail my hands, but it's not well received over video. Also, facial expressions that can be lost for lag time or they won't be viewable. So you sometimes might need to be overly use your facial expressions in an over dramatic way for anything to come through to the viewer. Finally, and I'll say it again, you know your story because you've practiced. So what kinds of stories should you tell? I'm going to talk through some different types of stories and share some examples as we go. There are creation stories, value stories, vision stories, success stories, and future stories. But my central question, what kind of story should you tell? My answer is it depends. Where are you as a program? If you are early in your program, meaning you haven't achieved any results, You may not even be serving participants. At this point, you may want to include a program description, highlight any partnerships, or illustrate who the program will serve. Now might be a good time to develop a creation or future story. What does your program do? Why does it exist? What gap will it fill? And still keep the techniques of keeping it personal. So you may make it a future story where if Karen came to your program, she could receive these type of services to help benefit her life with her and her family. The other stage you might be in the progress stage. If you're in the progress stage, your program's up and running, but long-term goals haven't been met. Your evaluation findings are not yet in. Now might be a good time to develop a success story as an example of your work and provide any early data that you might have, such as enrollment numbers or job placements. Or you might be operational. You might be in the operational phase where your program has demonstrated results that you want your audience to know about. And in a bit, I'll talk about how to share those evaluation findings. But for now, thinking of the narrative story piece, your success stories should illustrate how things have changed for the people your program serves. Your success story should be demonstrative of general results from your program. Don't pick a crazy outlier that's not demonstrative of general results. Or you might choose to share a course correction story that illuminates a program or policy change. How you should tell your story. Again, it depends. Who's your audience? Also, how much time do you have? If you only have moments to describe your program and why it's important, you need an elevator pitch. You need something quick and that people will hear, and it's an image that they're going to retain. Maybe it's a spotlight. You may get a paragraph in a partner's newsletter or on social media. You may be a panelist at a conference or on a segment of the local news. It could be that one-pager. A one-pager should be polished and it should convey the most important aspects of your program. You might include any of the different types of stories we talked about, along with pictures, graphics, partner information, and contact information. Or you might need to provide a full brief, and that's when you get a formal request for information. Maybe it's from a funder, maybe it's from a policymaker. Here, provide detailed information about your program model and the results. And it should highlight stories and achievements and those evaluation findings. I wanted to share a couple examples in addition to the example of my peacemaking story that I shared. And here is one that is a classic success story, and I think that they do it well. And as you'll see, it only takes less than a minute for me to deliver it to you, the audience. The first time Walter took a shower in his new bathroom, he cried. That's because it was the first time the 81-year-old had a bathroom to shower in. If I think about it, it'll make me shed some more tears, says Walter, sitting on the front porch of his white house 30 miles south of Atlanta. He spent what seemed like hours in that first shower. He says, the water was so hot and I just loved it. It was only a few months earlier that Walter's daughter, Francine, reached out to Southern Crescent Habitat. Francine was worried about her aging dad going to the outhouse at the edge of the backyard, especially at night. I didn't want him out there in the cold or falling in the dark, she says. Walter's parents had built the house, and it was the house where he raised his 8 kids. He had a job as a city street sweeper, but still couldn't swing the bathroom. It was embarrassing, he says. We had wash tubs, we heated water, we were clean. All those years, I never got used to not having a bathroom, Walter says. Now I'm so proud. I hope this story illustrates for you that details matter. They paint the picture of Walter and who he is. They form the image. South of Atlanta, 8 children. All of these things give the story life. The quotes matter. He worked hard. He was embarrassed he couldn't provide a bathroom for his family. Walter is now a person to his audience. I'm going to share another story here, and this is a progress story. And I'm sharing this because you don't have to wait to share anything about your program. You can share stuff about your program even while you're just in progress. And this story only uses one sentence with a photo to convey the meaning to the audience. A few community leaders finishing installing a well in the Okio community of Ghana that now serves 250 people. You have a story of that program. I am going to pause a minute to talk through something that's important and I wanted to draw your attention to. And that is, be careful when crafting your story to think about all the messages you may be sending. Be careful of stereotypes. When thinking about race, an important question programs should ask themselves: am I perpetuating a white savior story? These are often seen in literature and film, and programs have participated in this type of storytelling as well. Is your story communicating a trope of whites coming to the rescue of non-whites, particularly done in a self-serving manner? What I like about this photo and this progress story is the leaders are from the community being served. Some final advice on telling a narrative story. Avoid too much too soon. Don't overwhelm the audience with too many characters, locations, and detail. What I told you about Rose and Clara, I think was clear they're school-age kids. You didn't need to know their exact ages. You didn't need to know the streets that they lived on. I painted the picture for you with the details that I shared. The reader or listener should see themselves in the story. There are no at-risk youth, no disenfranchised seniors. There are no categories of people, just people facing challenges. Tim isn't a homeless man. Tim is a son and he lost his job. Don't accept we. It becomes impersonal. It's too easy to hide behind we. It's important for the listener to know exactly who drove what action. It gives the story clarity and life. Look for moments of vulnerability. Sharing a misstep or a mistake creates empathy for the storyteller and it conveys the authenticity of the story. Characters that are flawed are more interesting. Push for quotes and details. Like I said before, they add life. They fix a story in a place and time. If you're in the business of changing beliefs, ask two questions. What story is already in their heads? Is your story strong enough to replace it? And I'm going to share an example here. In the early 1990s, most Americans supported the idea of the death penalty. The Innocence Project, and I hope lots of you have heard of that amazing program, needed to change that narrative. Instead of asking if it was morally right or wrong, they shared stories about the wrongfully convicted based on DNA and evidence, and backed up their stories with the research that showed their stories weren't the occasional mistake, but an alarming trend. This narrative allowed the majority of Americans that support an eye for an eye, they believe in the death penalty, to concede that there needed to be a moratorium or an end of the death penalty until the causes of wrongful conviction could be eliminated. So I'm going to share this quote from Ira Glass from This American Life, which is one of my favorite storytelling programs. The most important thing you can hear, and the only thing that ever persuades any of us in our own lives, is when you meet somebody whose story contradicts the thing you think you know. At that point, it's possible to question what you know, because the authenticity of their experience is real enough to do it. So that's the end of part one, and I'm going to pause and see if Amanda had any questions that I can answer before we move to part two.
Yes, we have a couple of questions. One is, what kind of story can we tell if we haven't implemented our program?
Thanks for the question. Yeah. So I think you can tell a story about the vision of your program, what your program intends to do. I shared the example of, instead of just listing, we'll provide X, Y, and services, you could say, Heather, a potential participant, could engage in this type of service to meet this type of need. So you're still creating a narrative and you're still sharing what your program is going to do, but you're doing it in the future for what a participant may be able to accomplish when they come to your program. You can also talk about the gaps your program will fill and think about maybe a particular staff member or person from your program who ends up becoming the protagonist. So why was your program developed? Somebody had the idea. There was some reason that they saw a gap to be filled. There was something that needed to be done. So if you have a staff member who would feel comfortable becoming the protagonist and kind of talking through where they were in their life and why they thought this program was vital, you really can end up with wonderful stories. For reentry programs, I've seen it's often done with someone who themselves maybe went through a period of incarceration and now they want to give back and help other people who are also experiencing the difficulties of reentering.
Thank you for that response. We have a second question. Could you give examples of an elevator pitch?
Yeah, so it really depends on how much time you have and where your story's at. I could take the Rose and Clara story and shorten it. Or I could have a story that just feels shorter in duration anyway. So elevator pitches, I mean, if you heard the Rose and Clara story, it was less than 1 minute. So you may have less than 1 minute to talk, but if you have just a second or two, you might think about the biggest highlights of what your program's going to do and who it's going to serve so that you can get those out in a compelling way. I would avoid, if you can, using like not-for-profit or government lingo. So we talked about not calling it disenfranchised youth, or not calling it at-risk youth or disenfranchised seniors, sorry. If you can really make it human, that people in need because they lost a job, or if you have a particular person in mind, you could even craft it in that way. Okay, I'll move to part 2 if those are the questions, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So part 2, tell a story with your data. Why tell a story with your data? The true power of data comes from conveying the so what behind the numbers. Facts and data are more memorable when presented in the form of a story, which makes sense thinking about the science we talked about earlier. Numbers only engage the left part of the brain, the analytical part of the brain, while stories engage both the left and right side of the brain. So I am going to talk about 2 concepts and pull them apart because as you begin to look into this, you'll see these pop up. And that is data visualization and data storytelling. So data visualization, we're all pretty familiar with. That's because we don't generally see anymore someone presenting and they show like a spreadsheet with all their program data. Rather, they've somehow packaged that data into a chart or a graph of some kind. That's your data visualization, what you're putting up to show what's happening with your program. Data storytelling is using the words to explain what your data visualization means. You're helping your audience understand that data visualization that you're sharing. It's the story behind your data. What are the numbers telling the audience? And that's the piece that I think can be left out, is what is your data visualization telling your audience? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm behind a few prompts. So some key concepts. Know your audience. Who are they? What do they care about? What keeps them up at night? Direct your audience. Where do you want your audience to look? Recognize and eliminate clutter from any data visualization. If you have a piece of data that's not conveying a meaning, take it out of your visualization. Finally, use words. Words make numbers and pictures understandable for the audience. Use words to explain the key takeaways. Compelling stories follow a narrative arc. You need tension. What is the tension that matters for the audience? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time about what do we mean about decluttering your data and how we want to be able to convey this to our audiences. And I think it goes back to that first quote that I shared with you when we began this webinar. Your audience cannot face facts if they're looking the wrong way. So some key tools to decluttering your data and having good data visualization is contrast, color, position, and added marks. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped way forward in my presentation, apologies. And added marks. Almost always, less is more. As I mentioned, if you have a piece of data on your visualization that's not conveying a meaning, take it off. Cole Nussbaumer is really good at demonstrating these techniques, and she has a large number of YouTube videos online, so I encourage you to go watch them, and they're actually kind of fun to watch. I'm going to walk through a couple examples for you right now. So here's the example. The thing I want you to know is that there's a fire truck in this picture. Okay, find the fire truck. It takes a moment to find it, doesn't it? It doesn't pop out right away. How about now? When I do this, when I add a mark, it makes it much easier for you to find the truck, right? How about now? Even better. There's a sparing use of color. And now your audience knows exactly what you're trying to convey. There's a fire truck in this picture. If you share cluttered data visuals, you run the risk of losing your audience's attention or having them focus on what isn't important. Remember, you're telling a story with your data. What do you want the audience to know? If their eyes are pulled in too many directions because you haven't used contrast, you haven't used color, position, or added marks, and you haven't included words to tell your story, they may be missing the point. So I'm going to walk through another example that Cole shared on one of her YouTube videos. So this is a tweet from the Pew Research Center. As it says at the top, more Americans get news online. 50% of the public now cites the internet as the main source of national and international news. Still below television, but far above newspaper and radio. So this data is about the internet and the percentage of Americans that cite it as their main source of news. Looking at this graph, there's quite a few labels and they're kind of all over the place. So newspapers on the left side of the graph, and then television is up top, and radio down below and centered, and then internet to the right. My eyes have to jump a little bit all over this graph. And if I first look at the graph without reading the words, I'm not confident that I would know that the data they're trying to communicate to me is about the internet, that that's the takeaway. So now I'm going to share with you how Cole reworked this data visualization to convey the message to the audience more clearly. She got rid of the graph border. She titled the axes and decreased their contrast, so they're a lighter hue. And the axes say percentage citing the source and the survey year. She moved the title main source for news to the left. And she did that because we read from left to right. So it avoids eye jumping if that title is just there on the left. She also labeled the actual pieces of data right next to it. So 50% internet. It's there and super easy for the viewer to know that 50% internet is what's trying to be communicated. And importantly, because the story behind this data is about internet use, the only added color is that of internet. And that color matches up with keywords in the sentence above. So I'm going to share it for you side by side, just to illustrate how use of good data visualization and storytelling with that piece of data really helps the audience understand what you're trying to communicate and doesn't require them to do extra work. I'm going to share one more example, and this is from the organization I work for, the Center for Court Innovation. A paramount goal of New York State's bail reform was to reduce the number of people awaiting trial before any finding of guilt or innocence. The evidence is compelling that this goal was accomplished. Our analysis of the data from New York City shows that in the year following the April 2019 passage of the law, it contributed to a 40% decline in the city's pretrial jail population, with slightly greater reductions in the rest of the state. You can very quickly see on this data visualization that the story is about the 40% reduction. They wrote it in words. The viewer, the audience, doesn't need to somehow try to calculate in their head the difference between almost 5,000 and 3,000 is, what's that difference mean? We know what it means. It's a 40% reduction. Now, if I'd been consulted and taking some tips from Cole, I might have removed the grid lines. I don't think they actually do anything. And I might have used a softer hue for the accesses so that we had some contrast in the coloring with the top title, New York City's pretrial jail population. But the real punch, that there was a 40% reduction, the audience doesn't have to do any work. We've conveyed that meaning. We've done it in a crystal clear way. So I am going to share an example of a confusing data visual just to put the final nail in. Here is a data visualization where it's really hard to get any information out of it. So on the left, we see 2017. This is what happens in an internet minute. Now it's a pie graph and all the pieces are the same size, so I don't know what meaning that may or may not be conveying. There's tons of color. And then they show on the right an internet minute in 2018. Again, lots of color, but the same size pie graph. Like the sizes of the slices are all the same, so I don't know what that means. And then I have to do a lot of work as the viewer. So I don't know what they're trying to convey. What story are they trying to tell? Did one application beat out others in growth? Did one application totally tank? I would have to do a lot of work to know that. Also, some of the information communicated in the 2017 pie doesn't line up with the 2018 pie. For example, the Instagram slice, we look at posts uploaded in 2017, but then in 2018, we look at scrolling Instagram. I'm not an Instagram user, so I don't know what that means when we're looking at the two of them. So this is really hard to understand from the point of view of an audience, what they're trying to tell us. We'd have to do a lot of work. Generally, pie charts are harder to effectively communicate your message. It may work with a small number of categories, but if a bar graph is possible, test it out for comparison. You may find that the bar graph is much more effective. So here I'm going to share a data visualization that is absolutely stunning for you to take a look at. And this is US gun deaths in 2013. You can also look at it in 2010 if you wanted to know those numbers. This data visualization uses storytelling in just a couple words: stolen years. That's what matters, and that's what they're trying to communicate to the audience. It is a clear anti-gun message. There is no clutter. You probably won't remember the actual number of deaths or the number of stolen years, but you'll remember the story. You'll remember that image. Okay, our last pop quiz. I want to go back to the story I told you less than an hour ago and see what you may remember. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Debbie to put up that poll for us.
Can you see it?
Yes. All right, everyone, we'll give you 5 more seconds. Okay, Debbie, you want to share the results with us? Nice. People remembered correctly that it was a Rite Aid parking lot and that the community member said, knock it off, this is your future. Thanks, Debbie, for sharing those.
You're welcome.
I am going to take questions now, but I do want to remind you, and we'll only take a few minutes for questions, we are going to have that survey at the end. So if you could just hold on, if there happens to be a question, I can take it. Otherwise, we'll move to that survey.
The one question we've received is, could we get a copy of the presentation slides? And I will note this is a recorded presentation. We will be sharing a link to view it within the next few days, but Lisa, I'll let you know if you are willing to share the slides.
No problem, that's absolutely fine. Maybe when Amanda shares the link to the recording, we can also share the slides.
Great, we do have one more question. Do you have any recommendations about how to pick your messenger?
Meaning who from your staff is going to deliver that information, or what format you're going to deliver it in? I don't know if the person in real time is able to add that clarity.
They said both.
Both, okay. So I typically think your messenger, what has worked well for me in the past is whatever staff member
Not
is
together, but it's
closely
gone.
connected to the program. So from my story that I shared about the peacemaking program, Leah, our coordinator, often told the story because she could share it with a great deal of emotion because she was actually in the circle and she was connected. But if that person hates public speaking and absolutely does not want to do it, you may want to consider another staff member. Probably whoever just really has that knack for it. And if nobody does, practice, practice, practice. It gets easier. The format, again, audience, audience, audience. Your audiences will want different things. Oftentimes, policymakers and funders are very, very interested in those graphs. They're very, very interested in what the data tells them. They need those pieces, particularly if it's a funding application. However, they need it with a story because they're getting presentations of many, 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 many different programs, and you want your program to stick out. You want them to remember your program, particularly when budgets are small. If it is to a large group at like a neighborhood convening or a presentation, I always err on the side of keep it simple because I get nervous in front of a big crowd. I don't want to trip over my words. I don't want to get too in the weeds. I just want the primary message delivered. So I think the way in which you deliver it is really based on the audience that's going to be receiving it. Also, in the age of the internet, people are not often reading a lot of words. So I think that's one of the reasons we've seen a large growth in using words when sharing your data visualization is you need it right on that visualization itself because people may not bother to read the additional words. So I would go back to the example I shared from the Center for Court Innovation. they had some narrative that went along with their bar graph, but they were clear in putting the main takeaway right on the bar graph, because in our Twitter feed or other social media, people may not take the time to read the narrative that accompanied it, even though it was only a few sentences.
Thank you for that response, Lisa. We have received one more question. How might you frame a program that should be showing promising results, but maybe does not have a high frequency of these results due to low number of participants? What types of story might you tell at this point in the process?
Yeah, I do think that's a progress story. And I think that's okay to have that be just a specific example of an individual participant. Now, I say that different from an operational story because in your operational story, that success story or participant story you should be sharing should be demonstrative of general results. You don't want to mislead your audience with a complete outlier of a story that is not demonstrative of your normal results. So if you're in the business of getting people employed and you have one person who got a $500,000 job, that's not fair to share that story when most people are maybe getting a $50,000 or $30,000 a year job. But if you're in the progress phase where you maybe have only just a few participants, you're not yet getting results because the numbers aren't high enough, you really can pick an example and be clear that that's the stage that you're in and that's what you're sharing. I'd also think through, I don't think we often value stories of like what it means for the coordinator to be in this program and working with participants. So if you have a staff person where they become the protagonist, talk to them about what it feels like and what they hear. It can become very compelling to share the story of Leah and how being connected to these peacemaking participants and seeing them succeed really meant a lot to her. And then that demonstrates the value of the program because we hear how those participants succeeded.
Thank you for that response, Lisa. At this time, we don't have any more questions in the Q&A pod.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Amanda, I think then I'll flag it over to you for the final survey that we need to do. But I want to say thank you, everybody. I'm happy to field other questions, so speak to your site coach. I'm happy to jump on a call with anybody or work directly with a site coach as you all explore ways that you may be using these techniques within your own programs. So I will hand it over to you. Thank you, everyone.